A Bit Lit, celebrating research and creativity of all kinds.
Hello, wonderful A Bit Lit listeners, and I'm very, very excited today. I'm Dr. Eleanor Janega, one of the founders of A Bit Lit, and I am here joined by two of my favorite fellow medieval historians, David Perry and Matthew Gabriele, and I want to talk to them today about their really exciting new book, The Bright Ages, A New History of Medieval Europe. And as the name kind of evokes, one of the things that it's really doing that I think is very exciting, and what's very exciting for most medieval historians, is it is taking on very abruptly the mythology and conception of the Dark Ages, which is very unfortunately, I would say, the major way that people think about the medieval period as a whole. So I suppose my first question, just to get right down into it for you guys, is when you were putting this together, how did you conceive of yourselves as being involved in that ongoing kind of scholastic debate, and how did you think that this book could kind of take that on?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and thank you so much. We're so excited to be part of this series. It's something that I think that all medievalists struggle with, this idea of the Dark Ages, right? I mean, it's something that we confront, in our teaching and some of the scholarship that we consume and produce, is that we're always kind of fighting back against it, the idea of, or at least the prevalence of kind of fantasy medieval kind of traffics in those same types of tropes, even though, Game of Thrones isn't actually medieval, but, it has knights and, castles and stuff like that. And then there's dragons, but, medieval, everybody still thinks it's medieval. So I think that, when we were kind of putting together this idea for a book, and I should say, like, when we first put this idea together, it was a little bit more inchoate. We wanted to do something, we weren't sure what it was. And so we decided kind of ultimately, let's just go head on at this kind of big myth, because it allows us to talk about a bunch of different other things that are going on, to show how medieval Europe is ultimately a permeable place, that it's not closed off, that it's not an exclusively white place, that it had peoples from North Africa, from Asia, that there were people, living in northern England as early, as the 7th and 8th century, from North Africa and elsewhere, and things like that. And so, it allows us to use a bunch of different vignettes in order to deconstruct this idea, which I think has been really not just pervasive, but really poisonous. And not just in the public perception, but to scholars as well, is that we're always kind of fighting against it without naming it. And we wanted to just kind of, I think, name it, that this is what, this conversation is about, but do it in kind of an accessible, more public-facing way than in a traditional scholarly book.
I think that thank God firstly for that, because I think that you're right. There is almost this thing where any public facing discussion that medieval scholars have, the first thing that we have to do is very abruptly say, oh, and by the way, it wasn't like this. So it's really useful, I think, to have this as a tool out in the world. I suppose kind of going on from there as well, one more Dark Ages thing. So, it's interesting to me because when you talk to an average group of people and they bring up the Dark Ages, there will still be some people who raise their hands to say, aha, well, yes, the idea of the Dark Ages isn't really true. It's only true for Europe. And if you think about the Islamic Golden Age, then that was a wonderful thing that was happening at the time. So, you have this real kind of idea of perhaps the Dark Ages is a time, but only in one place, without anywhere else. And I think that one of the things that the book does is really address that head on as well. So yeah, is that the way that I interpreted the sites, for example, that you chose for this, seemed to be taking that on, because, we've got Baghdad in the book, there are any number of places around the Mediterranean, you get out onto the Asian steppes, it's like you're moving around with this, you're zooming. And so I kind of feel like that must have been conscious on your parts, no?
I mean, there's a couple different things to think about. First of all, I always like to say I'm as skeptical of Golden Ages as I am of Dark Ages. That's a different book, right? Why we should, but it's an important book. And it's not one I'm certainly about the medieval Islamic world. It's not one I'm going to write. But I think we have to be just as skeptical of Golden Ages, whether we're talking about I mean, 5th century Athens was a terrible place in terms of the number of wars and stuff, but somehow that's a golden age. And certainly, early imperial Rome might have been nice if you're at the elite of that society, right? But it's still kind of a slaveocracy. And I mean, I want us to be just as skeptical of golden ages and dark ages. And there are lots of people who are doing really interesting work thinking about the global Middle Ages, or I just saw from the person who tweets under medieval Indonesia, kind of the hemispheric Middle Ages as a slightly different way of framing that, and to what extent we can use the word medieval in different parts of the world. And again, I think these are really good, broader conversations. We really did want to focus on Europe, but a connected Europe, because we think, first of all, it helps us go at this dark age by saying, instead of having a hermetically sealed off continent, it's one that is in constant contact of all different ways, that is permeable and permeated with the broader world. So we wanted to sort of be in Europe and then go to another point outside and then come back and show how that happened, not just in terms of saying, well, this was happening here and this other thing was happening over there, but how they were in fact influencing and thinking about each other and in connection. So that was the goal all the way along. And again, I want us to get rid of the phrase "the Dark Ages" entirely. One of the really interesting conversations I've been having is people keep coming, and I know this is a matter near and dear to you, back saying, "Okay, well, I understand the Dark Ages, but can't we talk about like early England because there was a lack of sources?" And we talk about that a lot. That in fact, there is a lack of sources, but I'm like, why can't you just say there was a lack of sources instead of the Dark Ages? Why can't you say there's a decline in long distance trade rather than the Dark Ages, right? You can say the actual thing that we're describing rather than taking this phrase that has now this 600-year legacy. I think of it as a black hole. It's sucking you in. And if you try to sort of scoot around the edges of it, you will fail. You will fall into the black hole.
I think that's a really funny thing that you should mention, David, because, for example, when I chat to people about this and, mention the fact that where Dark Ages comes from, a lack of source is not intellectual decline.
Yeah.
I think that,
which is true, right?
It's true. It's true.
You can just say that. Yeah.
But it's really interesting because people who are really wedded to the sort of myth of the Dark Ages, they will immediately shoot back with, well, why do you think there was a lack of sources? And, and obviously, there are any number of reasons for that. But it's interesting because when they say that, what they mean is that either I get a lot of the time that people were burning books. That's one, as that there were sources and that the church then burnt them all. Which is, I'm like, I would love to see any citation of that. That would be really interesting for me.
I mean, it's like the Library of Alexandria, but kind of now floating,
but everywhere,
somewhere, but everywhere, yeah.
The Church of the Vandals, and then instead of that, if they don't come on that tack, it's like, oh well, literacy drops through the floor, no one's reading or writing, and that's not what happens. So they all just kind of decline into barbarism, and unlike the enlightened Romans who are sitting around writing with styluses, something like that. And I was wondering, can you just like expand a little bit on lack of sources for the period for those listeners at home who might not be aware of some of the reasons that we think might be for that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can start. I mean, I think one of the things that I would want to emphasize is what David is kind of saying is like, we need to be a little bit more specific when we're talking about kind of these larger periods. And I mean, the Middle Ages specifically, but the European Middle Ages specifically, but I mean, I think generally within the past is that, there was a decline of literacy, in the period, but I mean, that doesn't mean that it disappeared. And also there's a changing definition of what literacy means. And that's something that's always difficult to, when I try to explain to students, is especially like by the time you get to the Central Middle Ages, for example, like being literate meant that you could read and write Latin. It didn't mean that you couldn't read or write. Like, it was just a very narrow definition. And so, when they're talking about kind of medieval numbers, which are always notoriously tricky and difficult to kind of pin down how many people were doing X or how many people went there or something like that, they're always really difficult. I think that we have to think about the way that we're defining something versus the way that they were defining something. And so that's one of the issues. Now, that being said, there were fewer sources, but that doesn't mean that the period was unknowable. And I always think when people bring this up, and this is a little bit off topic, but I think it kind of comes back to the larger point, is that when I was in a graduate seminar, they made us take a methods course, and within the program I was in, they made us take a methods course, and so it was like me and then one other medievalist and like all the Americanists. And so, like, basically all the Americanists did for like an entire semester was make fun of how few sources we had. Like, we had to, and like, I remember, like, I wrote a research paper about like how we can understand this particular event around the year 1000 or something like that. And like I was working from like 3 or 4 written sources. And like everybody was just like couldn't get over that I could understand something from the past from 3 or 4 written sources. And like I try to emphasize like yeah, those are 3 or 4 written sources, but like we have things like archaeology, we have art and architecture, right? There might be other stuff out there. One of my graduate advisors, for example, like was on vacation in Italy at one point, went into a small town, and like they had an archive in the bell tower of the church that literally no one had looked at. Right. Like, so, and this was in the 1980s, right? Like there's other sources out there that could be used. So I think that, there's a difference between kind of what's published, which gives the impression, especially if it's published in English, for certain audiences, about versus what's actually out there kind of in the world. We rely as medievalists, we rely perhaps too much on, critical editions without thinking about kind of manuscript survival, in which oftentimes there's dozens, if not hundreds of other manuscripts that are out there that can tell us something about them. But that requires going to an archive, which not just in the pandemic, but, especially for American-based scholars, that can be very difficult. But it gives the illusion, I think, that there's a lot less out there than there actually is.
That's a really good point. It's if you don't have a travel budget, you don't have a travel budget. So whose dark ages are they? I suppose going on from there, there's this also one of the things I find really interesting about the book is the time periods that you chose, because this is another one of these dark ages myths where people will say, well, the Dark Ages, that is a sort of term that is interchangeable with the medieval period more generally. Whereas scholars, if we use it at all, which we don't, but we take it to mean the earlier medieval period. And when people say to me, oh, the medieval period, when does that start? I always say, the fall of Rome, quote unquote, of Western Rome in 476 up until question marks. But what I really, really like about the book is that it doesn't start in 476. Yeah. And you start beforehand, and you start in Ravenna. And I think that this is a really wonderful and astute thing to do, because I am constantly trying to, when I say I don't believe in the fall of Rome, because I don't think that anyone walked outside and said, oh, the world's completely different. My life has changed irrevocably. And now I'm in a new period, the medieval period, and so I think that it was really smart because you start a bit earlier. And can you tell me a little bit about that decision?
Yeah, I was actually looking at our book proposal just this morning because someone wanted to see it, and it reminded me of how both similar and different the actual book is to what we said we were going to write. But that in fact, that opening moment in the 430s in Ravenna has been the moment since very early. And I can remember when I wrote the very first draft of that sentence, but I can't remember how we decided that's how it would start. I have no memory. I mean, that with so much of the book, Matt and I just spent so much time talking and writing and rewriting that I don't remember how we started it. But what I can know is that we did want to locate it in the 5th century and not say with the founding of Constantinople. We wanted to start in the 5th century, but that we wanted to start within a moment that was generative, that throughout the 5th century, there are absolutely moments of destruction, as there are in every century I'm aware of, and some more than others, and some moments, political entities are more or less stable, and the 5th century's got a lot of instability, but there are also moments of creation. And so then I definitely was thinking about, in particular, that beautiful so-called Mausoleum of Galatia, but it's really a small chapel that she likely commissioned and definitely contributed some objects to as patroness. And just being in that space and understanding it as a space that had a lot of the iconography of early Christianity, but had a sense of sacred space of the longer pagan traditions. It is a hybrid space and should be understood as a hybrid space, and a space that is stunning, that is blue. So it's gorgeous and colorful in exactly the way we wanted to focus on, and has a lot of meaning to me personally in terms of my time in that section of Italy. And I'm not going to pretend like David and Matt wrote this. We have things that we like. Matt is really interested in conch and the Golden Girl and the Golden Girls. So there are other things we could have written about for that chapter, but Matt has spent a lot of time thinking about that particular reliquary, and it works. And there's lots of examples like that in terms of what we picked. So for me, that chapel, but also then once you start reading about Galla Placidia, she's just, she's one of the most powerful figures of the 5th century. So why not start with her? She is a woman, and we definitely wanted to start right from just like with the Bright Ages, right from the jump, saying that women were half the people in the Middle Ages, give or take, and we're gonna spend a lot of time talking about them right from the start. And also, she is knowable in some ways, just as these other people we talk about are, not just in her, if Rome had fallen in 410 and the East was dominant, that would have been news to at least the Galla Placidia that was writing letters to the emperor telling them that he was doing Christianity wrong and that he should be listening to the Pope. Like, she wrote that letter, right? Yeah. She commissioned these extraordinary works of art. She had an infant son who died in his first year, and I didn't know this when we started writing. She was buried next to his coffin in Rome. And we don't know how his coffin got there. Has she been just carrying it with her? She didn't live in Rome. She was visiting Rome. How did it but it speaks to a kind of, yes, these are people living in a very different era, but it's still a mom mourning for her dead child. And so kind of a very human moment too, because we wanted to say the Middle Ages are human and are knowable. And so that's really where we open with, and have from almost the very first day of writing the book.
Yeah, and I think that's, just to add on to that just a little bit, I think is that's really what we're trying to emphasize, I think, with the book, is you were talking about kind of this bigger issue of periodization a minute ago, Eleanor, and that, I think if you get 10 medievalists in a room and you ask them kind of when did the the European Middle Ages start and when did they end, you're probably going to get 10 different answers. Yeah. Right. And part of that depends on kind of what audience you're talking to, what you're, trying to emphasize and stuff like that. And so, by focusing on this is somebody we can know that we do know something about, this is what it can tell us about this particular period. It helps us kind of pull down these artificial numbers that have for so long kind of predetermine the way that we think about what happens kind of after that. Right. In the same way with, with ending, right? Like ending with Dante, in that maybe same chapel, about 1,000 years later, like that allows us to weave a narrative that moves in different ways than, if we started in 476 or ended with 1453 or with the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks, or 1349 with the advent of the Black Death or something like that. Like, it's just a different type of story that allows us to tell, which again isn't, as David was saying, kind of recuperative of the Middle Ages as some kind of golden age, but really just one that's ultimately kind of knowable.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I suppose one of the things that I really like is this emphasis on humanity and persons, even within that. So you do such a great job of kind of connecting these stories of people, and there are times when it's quite funny, and I'm kind of like laughing along with it, but at the same time, you also do a really great job of doing descriptions of art as well. And, this is one of these huge challenges of publishing generally, is like getting a picture and, being able to pay for a picture, but you guys almost were able to obviate that need by just using your words real good, which
if we had another $20,000 and could put, 200 more pictures in, or 50,000 or whatever, I would have done it. If I could put a color picture every other page, I would have, but that's not.
Yeah. So you've got this really interesting time spread, and I already alluded to this really interesting geographical spread You have as well. So, yeah, you've got your usual characters like Rome and Conch and, Aachen and, all of these places. But we also get Baghdad, and we also get the steppes, and, even references out to the further east as well. And so I really like how you're able to use these to play up, as you say, the permeability of Europe and the kind of back and forth that happens. Now, how did you make the decisions about who's coming in on that one?
Well, I mean, that's the $1 million question, and there's thousands more words that were kind of left on the floor that we had written, and I think the original proposal probably had about 6 or 7 more chapters. Like, we were just going to try to do a lot more. But the thing that we felt that was going to do, if we included all that material, is it would move us more towards a textbook. We really didn't want to be comprehensive in that way. Is that we were trying to tell a different, again, kind of give an impression of what the European Middle Ages were like, rather than trying to produce some sort of book stopper that ultimately tells you kind of everything that you might want to know about the period or about the geography. So back to your question about geography, like, how did we decide kind of where it is that we wanted to spread, right? Like, and one of the things that we had from the very beginning, I think, was to show that Europe was permeable, and meaning that Europeans or people who lived in Europe at the time moved out of Europe and moved around within Europe. But then people who lived outside of what we now think of as Europe moved into Europe and around within Europe as well. That the world, the mental world that they conceptualized as what was part of their everyday existence included places like North Africa, it included places like Jerusalem, it included Baghdad. For some people, for many people, it included the Kievan Rus. It included, the far north of Scotland. It included places across the Pyrenees and Iberia. Iberia is another weird one that often gets kind of left out of discussions of Europe, most likely because it was under predominantly Islamic control. And so that's not, quote unquote, Europe in a lot of people's imagination. But it fundamentally is, right? People crossed the Pyrenees. The Pyrenees were more an imaginary than a real boundary. Even as back, as the early part of the Carolingian period, and certainly the Merovingians, actually, even before them, like that was just you went around the Pyrenees or you went over the Pyrenees or whatever. And so, as we're trying to demonstrate is that, like, we didn't want to take the focus away from Europe, mostly because, like, that's what we know. And so we didn't want to give the impression that we were experts in these other periods and places in which there are phenomenal scholars doing work on those areas. But we wanted to try to acknowledge the work that's being done and how talking about Europe in isolation really does a disservice to both to Europe, but also to all that other exceptional scholarship that's being done on the Islamic world, on Jewish communities, both in Europe and across the Mediterranean, with the work that's being done on the Mongols, especially as relates to their connection with the spread of the Black Death. Or the Second Plague Pandemic, in the 13th and 14th centuries, again with Iberia, and then even in the epilogue a little bit about the North Atlantic world, is that the North Atlantic world was very quickly part of their mental imagination as well, and something that needs to be acknowledged and talked about. So,
and with each, we never pulled up a map and colored in shaded bits when we knew we were covering them and tried, maybe we should have, but we never did that. Right. What we did is we followed stories and probably every chapter, but certainly, I think every chapter, there's kind of a hopefully kind of simple but important story in it. So for example, our chapter on early Islam is not a summative complete history of the expansion of Islam, because that would be a very long book that has been written many times by many people, right? But it's really trying to say Islam reorients the world in interesting ways. It is beginning to work against kind of our clash of civilizations narrative, but also at the end it says, look, Islam is a European religion the whole time. It's from founding. There are always Muslims in Europe the whole time. They live there. They belong there the whole time. It's not only a European religion, but you cannot tell the history of medieval Europe without saying Muslims live there. They are not the outsider. When we're talking about the Vikings, in kind of 10 sentences at the beginning of that chapter, we get from North America to Scandinavia to Sicily to Baghdad. And it's authentic. That's what they did. And so again, kind of, we try to follow those sorts of stories, and some stories are very localized. And some story within, because that's the story you want to tell in that chapter, and other ones are really, sort of making these big connections, and that was really the thinking behind scope. That, and then once you start doing that, your world gets bigger.
And I should say too, I mean, I think, I don't know that this was a conscious thing, but I think we kind of realized we were doing it. And I don't want to speak for David, but I'm thinking, like, I think about it more now that the book is out in the world, is like, most medieval histories, when they try to tell a kind of or most histories of the medieval Europe, when they try to tell kind of a comprehensive story, is they focus kind of on the big three. They're still kind of nationalistic, like it's Germany, France, or England, or some sort of combination thereof. It's very Northern European. Scandinavia gets a nod. They talk about kind of the legacy of Rome, but mostly kind of as like through a papal thing. And then every once in a while they mention Constantinople. And so I think we wanted to pull it more towards the Mediterranean, that story more towards the Mediterranean, because that allowed us to have those kind of conversations about people moving and, connecting with one another, sometimes violently and sometimes non-violently.
I mean, one of the things that I really enjoy in terms of that, the spread, right, and the movement of things, is because you've got this gorgeous and really well placed focus, I think, on art and and trade generally, because there's also this pervasive myth generally that, well, everything was ugly in the medieval like in the medieval period generally, like there's that, which is interesting. I got a lot to say about that, but we're for another time. But also, within that, there's this idea of Europeans having absolutely no access to the quote unquote exotic, right? And so you'll see this in, oh well, it wasn't, they had to get spices from the Muslims, and things like this. This idea that like no one had ever heard of cinnamon or something at the time. And I think one of my very favorite trade item that comes up in this book, and that I think really puts paid to this whole idea, is an elephant. And I just thought that was so savvy, because it's not just an elephant, right? It's an elephant in the German lands. So it's like, we're not talking about Hannibal. We're not talking about getting an elephant into Italy somehow. It's like, this is a long trip for a guy such as that. And I thought that was so incredibly well thought out. But I'm wondering if you could just talk to us a little bit about how you made these decisions on what is the trade commodity, or what is the art that we're going to focus up on in each chapter.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it was just kind of natural, is that we wanted to focus on, we were trying to follow this metaphor of brightness throughout. So a lot of it had to do with kind of, gold or stained glass or something like that. But then there were the other things that kind of emerged. And I mean, I spent, I'm a Carolingianist in some ways. In other ways, I'm not. And I don't know what I'm doing. So, but anyway, I had to talk about the elephant, because the idea, again, of an elephant in northwestern Germany, right? Like, that's a weird thing. And the fact that it was acknowledged, and then like, oh, that was a really cool thing. And then the elephant died, and then there's never another elephant, right? Yeah. It's kind of strange in that way. But again, pulling off of some of the really wonderful scholarship that's been done on Abul Abbas, right, the elephant who visited, who was sent from the Abbasid Caliph all the way to Charlemagne's court in Aachen, is thinking about the journey. Like, what did that mean? And again, like the people they must have encountered, the obstacles they must have overcome, because although it was really neat and it was requested and it was expected that this elephant would get there, like, how do you ship an elephant around the year 800 from across, because it was probably an African elephant, it seems like now, from somewhere south of the Sahara, that moves through probably didn't go to Baghdad, but went through Egypt, then across North Africa, across the Mediterranean, up all the way across Italy. Like, what did the people who, and we didn't really talk about this, but like, what did the people who encounter him think? Just along the way. Like, what if you're in Rome one day and you walk out, going to the market, like to buy a thing of bread, and like there's a freaking elephant that walks, down the street. Like, that's going to be like a phenomenal thing. So I think that we let our not imagination, but imagination kind of carry us through some of those kinds of conversations. The other thing that, like David mentioned, for example, like one of the chapters focuses on the monastery of Conques, and they have a really gorgeous kind of golden reliquary there of a small young girl, Saint Faith, Sainte Foy, right? And so thinking about that icon and how it would have been encountered and what the experience of that would have been like, right? Or when we talk about Paris, for example, like Saint-Chapelle and the sea of blue of the stained glass within that cathedral, but then just outside of it, like the light of the burning Talmuds, in the Place de Grève that were happening right at the same time that Saint-Chapelle was happening. So I think that that metaphor of brightness led us to think in kind of different ways about not just kind of what exists on a page, but what was the lived experience like? Like when you walked in a place, what did it look like? What did it smell like? What did it sound like? And trying to capture as much as possible, within a very limited number of words about what experience that was. And not just, and again, within the within that idea of kind of encounter, because it's not just like things that are local, like people and things moved. So to think about kind of what was brought into that space, how was it brought there, and trying to give our readers as full a picture of that experience as we could.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's really like people. So Matt started as a Carolingianist. I started as a Venetianist. In Venice, I wrote a lot of words on Venice. We cut, which is fine. But we kept Italian cities, right? We needed Italian cities, and we wanted to do a thing where we brought the book at the end back to Ravenna and to Dante and Ravenna, and that was that was the mission. Writing is hard. You cut a lot of stuff, but in Venice, right? Like I spent a lot of time reading texts that very few people in Venice would have seen. But they all would have stood outside San Marco and seen the massive mosaic cycle telling the same story. Tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people over centuries, maybe, I don't know, right? They all would have seen that. We know they would have seen that. Now, sometimes we have evidence about what viewers thought, and sometimes we don't, but we know that they saw it. Similarly, though, with less fancy stuff, I like to talk a lot about my friend Kathleen's work on coconuts in medieval England, because there are coconuts in medieval England. And so even if you as an individual medieval person never crossed a boundary, the boundaries came to you, things crossed them and came to you, and then you had to make sense of them. They were in your food. They were the physical worlds around you. There's a great book I haven't read yet on, kind of household goods after the plague in late medieval England. I'm really excited about, because it's there's really fancy stuff that matters, but there's also like where you get your clay, where, how you make your pots, what dyes are traveling, things like that are the everyday stuff of the world. And if we didn't do as much social history, we didn't talk as much about peasants as we might have. I mean, there's plenty, we can talk more about what we didn't talk about, but right there, people are there and they're consuming things and they're hearing stuff. And so you have to get into that world.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I love Kathleen's work on coconuts, so I must drag her on here at some point. Just a reminder. But also, I think it's one of the things that I always bring up is my friend Sarah, who's an art historian, always brings up lapis lazuli that you use to make ultramarine, which is like the blue for manuscripts, right? And ultramarine being, over the sea, and this idea that people understand that it's, this ability, this color of blue has come to them from Afghanistan, and they understand it to be this huge luxury that's come from a very far away place, and they understand themselves as connected into that trade network as a result of it. And also, it's very beautiful.
I was today years old when I realized that ultramarine, of course, meant over the sea. Even though I study outre-mer as a, I just never.
No, literally, she had to say it to me, and I was like,
yeah. Yeah. Once you say it out loud. Okay.
I was like, oh yeah, okay.
This has been an educational experience for me.
I was kind of thinking about it. I suppose the entire time as ultra in that kind of 90s intensifier
yeah,
way.
Super marine.
Ultramarine, man.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's totally right.
But within this, I suppose I also wanted to nudge you onto one of my favorite medieval things that you really got in there very nicely, which is cons, which is what I've written in the notes, dear listeners, about this, because I was so excited to see some. Because in the first place, I'm but an amateur lover of the conates. I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm just a scholar who thinks they're neat, and one of the things that I thought was so great is you bring up one of my favorite interactions between Europeans and the various conates, which is a couple of Franciscans who kind of like rock up to the court of Monte Khan and go, "Does anyone want some Christianity? Can I interest you in that?" And everyone's like, "You're not wearing shoes, bro." And it's like, then like a confusion abounds. But I love that you got the story in the first place, because I think that it's just a great story. But also, I think that it's such a clever thing to use here, because again, when people think about the nebulous Dark Ages, and even when you get the Islamic Golden Age, there'll be also be there's this kind of threatening Mongol horde at all times, and they're very bad, right? They're very bad, and they are very violent. When Alexander the Great does it, that's good, just so you know. But but if anyone from Asia does it, then no, it's very, very bad. And I think that there is this real kind of idea of for example, Mongolian people at times like choking trade or not allowing it through, or not allowing goods and people through. And they're kind of like, patted these Franciscans on the head. They're like, "We already know about Christianity, got one right here. And why don't you go have a fun time?" And off they go to China, the Franciscans. So I really, really loved that. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about your decision to kind of bring these guys in particular in. I mean, I'm delighted. I want them there, but I'm just like, why do they make the cut, I guess?
So once again, we're trying to think, kind of what is at least one of the narratives about the Mongol Age, and one of them is the violence. There was plenty of violence, but there's conquests come with violence, and then there's the trade issue, which is they in fact were. The Mongol Empire only worked for as long as it did because of long distance trade and profits. But the other narrative that at least that I've encountered is kind of the West, saying that on purpose, is isolated, and then the Mongols come and they're forced into contact with the East. And there's a lot of, whoa, the East. And also the Mongols are like, who are these barbarians? And in fact, there has been contact across those borders for a long time. And the Mongol Empire changed the stakes and the scale and in really important ways that have huge impacts on all kinds of things, including eventually the plague pandemic. But that, this encounter between the Franciscans and the Mongols was not of, aliens. From the perspective of the Mongols, like, oh yeah, another group of Christians. Why don't they wear shoes? Like, that's the weird thing about them. Why aren't they wearing shoes? Not, what is this strange religion? And, we must crush it or something. They get a letter from the Pope saying, essentially convert or you'll be destroyed. And they're like, that's great. You surrender or we'll actually come and destroy you because we have a big army. But it's just not that unusual. And so we really wanted to sort of, so again, there's this narrative of encounter that is new, as opposed to encounter that is intensifying pre-existing contacts with some often inchoate, sometimes totally wrong. I mean, we could talk a lot about Prester John and there's plenty of things that are confusing and wrong. There are lots of new things that happen in each chapter of the book that didn't happen. There is change, but that it's not this, again, kind of a sealed off West forced into contact with the East. Again, using these very problematic terms on purpose for the first time because the Mongols arrive, or for the first time only because of the Crusades, which is another kind of related narrative that is out there. That these are ongoing contexts that do rise and fall with intensity depending on what else is going on.
Yeah, I really love also within that, as you mentioned, this sort of like, well, here's your letter from the Pope that says you're very bad. And that we're going to have a war. And I think that, the kind of the treatment of this being like, yeah, bro, yeah, we're also going to war you. Like, I think it's a really nice thing to kind of see come up, because I think one of the things that people tend to think is that this is an era when, if the Pope says something, then like every Christian is going to get together and they're going to battle an army. And it's like, not even the Pope's guys think this is going to happen. They're just like, this is, that's the thing that we got funding. He said, if we deliver this letter, and then everyone's like, yeah, okay, here, sure, cool. And then, and they kind of like do the same thing back, it's not unlike when I think it's Frederick II gets that letter that is like, the Pope is like, you need to go fight some Mongols. And he's like, and the Mongols are sending him letters being like, oh, I'm going to kick your ass. And he's like, I will be your falconer, because I'm good at that. And it's like, he just doesn't care. Like, the Pope can't make him do anything.
Yeah.
And then the Mongols are like, oh, okay, yeah, this guy's not doing anything. Great. But there are all these ways that people who are at these really high levels of society communicate with each other. And they don't necessarily think that this is something that's going to happen. And I think that you do a great job with this of kind of communicating how there isn't actually this kind of alarm or panic where everyone rushes out to do something at the bidding of like some powerful guy. Necessarily.
I mean, medieval power is always contingent, is always hemmed in by law and tradition and logistics. I mean, right? And there isn't even a concept of. I mean, the three of us know this, but this idea of absolute monarchy is not a medieval idea. Now, to what extent it really existed in the 17th century, that's for other people in a different podcast to argue about. But at least it was an idea in the, in those centuries. It's just not even, it's not an idea about medieval kingship or medieval papal monarchy. I mean, that's just not the idea. There are some popes who dare to dream that at least, kings might go to war in places where they say more frequently. But like it's just not, medieval power is always contingent and contested. And that's the interesting thing about it, right? It had sort of, the journey of the kings of France to successfully conquer most of France. Like they had to conquer France. They didn't just have it. They had to do this. And that's, and that to me are the most interesting stories about medieval power.
Yeah. And it gets, I think, another thing I love that the way that you phrased it, Eleanor, too, is that one of the things we really try to emphasize is that people made choices in the Middle Ages. Like it wasn't that somebody said something and then they did it. It was just like, they decided whether or not they would do it. And certainly that range of possibilities from which they could choose was not infinite, but it never is, right?
Yeah.
But medieval people were the same way. Like there were certain factors that went into whether or not they decided to go on a crusade or to, pursue this pilgrimage or to trade with this group or to persecute the Jews or kind of whatever, right? And they made choices for reasons, and we can get at why those, why they made the decisions they did, but also to point out that, it could have been otherwise. Right. Like, one of the things David loves to talk, and I'll let him talk about Belisarius, which is just a phenomenal example, which would have kind of changed everything. But like even a smaller one is that, when we talk about the burning of the Talmud by Louis IX, King Louis IX in Paris, this of the Jewish law books, is like the bishops, like some of the bishops resisted him, and they in fact put it off, and it almost didn't happen. And there's specific reasons why it did happen, but it didn't necessarily have to. Like it seems like a foreordained conclusion, given the way that we look back at the past in these certain things. But there's lots of historical contingency there in which people made decisions, and outcomes could have been something other than they were.
And sometimes you can kind of see that in play. Again, there's the famous banning of I could talk about Belisarius, and I'd love to, but there's the famous banning of Aristotle in Paris, in which people who want to see the Middle Ages as barbaric and cut off from classical antiquity until the Renaissance cite. But down the road in Toulouse, which is not very far, they said, "Oh, Paris is banning Aristotle. We've got Aristotle. Come here." And Toulouse is just as much a part of the Middle Ages as is Paris. Just as later we say a medieval Italian city is just as much as part of the Middle Ages as a Welsh castle, right? You can't, like, these places are very different from each other. They're making different decisions in real time, and we can kind of see them do it. The Belisarius example is the citizens of Ravenna. He's the general for Justinian. The citizens of Ravenna, which he's conquering for Justinian, say, "How about we surrender and you just become the emperor of Rome in Italy?" And it must have been tempting. It's his own biographer who writes about it. So I find it a credible source in the context of what was going on with that text. And if he had said so, suddenly, we're in the 6th century, and we've snapped back to where we were in 400 with an Eastern emperor and a Western emperor, two strong. right there, 30 or 40 years, I would have to do math and I'm not going to, after 476, after the deposition of this last Western emperor, which is where people start the Middle Ages, it could have just been undone. He could have just said yes. And there are really interesting reasons why he didn't, and we try to get into them, and the story plays out at Constantinople. But he made a choice, and that one happens to have been written down for us, so we can see it in action. And that's less common, I think, in our sources, but that one's there.
Okay, so last question. I've got a fun one for you. Which is, so we've already alluded to this, right? Because you cover so many interesting things. We've cut at least 6 chapters from the book. Yeah. What didn't make the cut?
I think David should start because
I'll go first.
Yeah, because he's still mad at me for this.
I'm still mad at. I mean, I've already told you about Venice. I've already told you about Venice, but that's not the one I'm mad at. The one that I'm actually mad about, I'm not mad about, but I think about a lot, is the figure Matilda of Tuscany, who was the ruler of Tuscany in the 11th century, and is just one of the most interesting people in the Middle Ages in so many ways, and is one of these people who, like Galla Placidia, allows you to reframe a classic story. There's the story of the investiture controversy, Pope versus Emperor, and as it really comes to a head in its first phase, the Pope excommunicates the Emperor, and the Emperor has to go. The Emperor's lords rebel against him, and the Emperor has to go barefoot in the snow and abase himself before the Pope in the castle of Canossa. And that's Matilda's castle. And Matilda, this woman who really creates Tuscany as an important place, creates Florence as an important place. And that's the chapter is getting us to Dante. So, we're trying to get to Florence, but we just didn't need a long section on Matilda. But you could retell the story of the investiture controversy, with Matilda and you should, in fact, as a really essential player. We didn't tell the story of the investor controversy, and that I'm very comfortable with. I'm happy not. I mean, we do talk about popes and kings, but we didn't do an investiture chapter, though it was certainly on our early list. But losing Matilda, and just things like, it's not just her political life, but there's a lot of writing about her sex life and about her lack of husbands, and I mean, there's just a bit, her organizational role specifically in the city of Florence. If you're interested in urban history, I could write a lot about Matilda, and maybe someday I'll get to.
Yeah,
but it wasn't what the chapter was about, and so ultimately you have to, as Matt pointed out to me, perhaps more than once before I
ouch. Okay.
Yeah, he was right. Yeah. He was right.
What about you, Matt?
So, I mean, it's kind of hard to say anything. I mean, like I mentioned at the very outset, like looking at our proposal, like, I mean, we had like 7 or 8 more chapters in there that we were thinking about including. And so it's hard to kind of pick something specific. I'll mention 2 very briefly that I think are really just fascinating and I'm really interesting. One kind of personally, because I've worked on this, on the scholarly side a little bit, is the Emperor Otto III. Who was, a Roman emperor, a German ruler. He lived over the course of right around the year 1000. The product of a Byzantine princess and a German emperor, had pretensions for universal monarchy, was very interested in resurrecting kind of Rome in a very different way than, Charlemagne had a couple of centuries before, but was very interested in the memory of Charlemagne as well. Like, just a really fascinating character in his own right, and especially connected with the Dukes of Poland and stuff like that. But anyway, but maybe the one that I would focus on is I would have loved to push a little bit more into the 15th century and talk about the end of the Christian conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, and talk about like 1492 and Ferdinand and Isabella and its connection with Columbus's expedition. And that's something that I talk a lot about. When I end my general medieval survey, it's often kind of one of the last things that we end up talking about, because I really see it as fundamentally kind of medieval as part of, but a transition point kind of out of, because you're dealing with the North Atlantic, the move out of kind of Europe, especially into the Atlantic world, both south around Africa. So you can start talking about kind of the European slave trade, or the African slave trade and the beginnings of that, but then also about the encounter with indigenous Americans, First Nations people, as well as that, but also kind of this hardening of the idea of Christendom in a way that is seen as kind of medieval, again with quotes around it, but is ultimately something a little bit different. right, is the expulsion of the Jews follows with the conquest of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom, the expulsion of Muslims, the Columbus's expedition, and again the encounter with the Africans. Is that again it's kind of creating a pure Christian state in a way that hadn't been seen before, or really hadn't even been conceptualized in the same way. And so I think again that gets at, or at least when I try to talk about it with my students, it gets at kind of how our ideas about the Middle Ages are not the same as what the Middle Ages actually, or at least the European Middle Ages, are actually were.
Oh gosh, that's such a good answer. Anyway, yeah, I'm like now. I mean, for the second edition, I want to see both those chapters in. That's my homework assignment, so. Okay, like tell your editor it was my fault. But anyway, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us here at A Bit Lit to talk about this. Everyone, one more time, that's The Bright Ages, a new history of the Middle Ages. Absolutely brilliant. I cannot recommend it enough. Bought it for everyone I know for Christmas, so I can't. There's no way for me to more highly recommend this book than to tell you that I bought it for my dad. So please get a copy. Let us know what you think. And if you have any questions, I'll pass them on to these guys. I'll keep bugging them. It's fine. So but thank you so much for joining us, guys. We really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, this is great.
Thanks for having us. This was fun.